The Great Lakes are enormous. They are the largest group of freshwater lakes by area and the second largest by volume. Alone, they represent 21% of the world's supply of fresh water. They're often called inland seas, not just because they're large, but also because they have rolling waves and strong winds and other sea-like characteristics. And it's no surprise that they have acted as avenues of trade for centuries, carrying goods from east to west. And where you have trade, well, that attracts crime, which, when it's on a sea, is called piracy. And in the early 1900s, a man who really looked nothing like a character out of Pirates of the Caribbean made a name for himself in that ancient profession. Because after all, don't all good stories involve pirates? Daniel William Seavey was born in the 1860s in Maine. The date usually given is 1865, but that predates his parents' marriage, and the census suggests he was born in 1869. This is only the beginning of the contradictions and uncertainties that surround the story of Dan's life, murky as it is in the records. His mother died in an accident in 1872, lighting a match at the same time that a bottle of camphor fell from a shelf and was spilled upon her person. Highly flammable, the camphor burst into flames instantly. Dan's father, Porter, seems to have been mostly a carpenter, though at some point he did become the captain of a schooner. At a young age, traditionally 13, Dan is said to have run away from home to serve on tramp schooners, that is, schooners that have no published schedule but remain for hire at a moment's notice. From there, he joined the U.S. Navy sometime between the ages of 15 and 18. He later claimed to have been in the service around 32 months, but details of his service are unknown, and there's reason to question his claim. The American Navy was at a low point at the time, and in 1880 had as few as 48 ships in commission and a mere 6,000 sailors. By the early 1880s, he had given up his life at sea to move inland to Peshtigo, Wisconsin. Most biographies say he worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Wisconsin and Minnesota, but again, the details of what he might have done in that position are unknown. Another source identifies him merely as a government agent who chased after whiskey smugglers. By the late 1880s, he moved to nearby Marinette, where he married his wife, Mary Plumley, who was only 14 at the time of their marriage. He would have been around age 20. In Marinette, he is thought to have been working as a professional trapper. By adulthood, Seavey was proving to be an imposing figure. He was over 6 feet tall, weighed 250 pounds, and spoke with a New England accent. One biographer described him. His muscular upper torso, bedecked with very long arms and huge hands, tapered into a trim lower body, creating an extremely imposing physique. The same source also claims that Seavey was occasionally described by women as the most handsome man in town. He seems to have also had a large personality, which led him to the nickname Roaring Dan. He and Mary would have 2 daughters in the small town of Middle Inlet. In the 1890s, he took the family south to Milwaukee, where by 1896 he was operating a tavern with a business partner at 214 Sycamore Street, near the harbor. It is likely through the saloon that he met Frederick Pabst. Pabst had deep connections in Milwaukee. Born in Prussia, his family had come to Milwaukee in 1848. Pabst had taken to the lakes, starting as a cabin boy, and by age 21 captained a steamer on Lake Michigan. It was much later that he bought into his father's brewery, which under his leadership became the Pabst Brewing Company. An interesting side note occurred around the same time. In 1896, Dan returned to Maine with his sister. According to the Boston Herald, Seavey met his sister, Jenny, by chance in Milwaukee, and an infatuation took possession of them. They were living together in a one-room apartment when Seavey attempted to pass a counterfeit dollar. The store owner found Seavey suspicious and had him arrested. Seavey swore he received the coin as change for a $5 bill. Police searched his apartment, where they uncovered a counterfeiting laboratory with supplies of aluminum and other metals, as well as molds on hand. Seavey insisted that he wasn't a counterfeiter, and that he sometimes made tokens. In addition to the crime, suspicion was thrown on the sibling relationship. The Portland Daily reported that they had been living in one room, and to every appearance like man and wife. Their manner towards each other is not at all like brother and sister. In May, the pair were charged with counterfeiting, and a furious Seavey promised to make it hot for Portland, Maine newspapers, which he said had been slandering him. Seavey, however, had a lot of evidence against him and little money. He was never able to pay the $1,000 bail set for him. He eventually pled no contest in September and was fined $10 and sentenced to 6 months hard labor. By 1898, he was back in Milwaukee with his family. when news of a different sort carried him halfway across the world. In August of 1896, gold was discovered in the remote Klondike region of the Yukon, Canada. Like the gold rushes that preceded it, thousands of people would abandon their jobs and charge headlong into unknown territory in search of fortune. The height of the rush began in the summer of 1897, especially after over $1 million of gold was brought into Seattle in July. When he caught wind of the rush, Seavey seems to have wasted little time abandoning his life in Milwaukee in favor of adventure. Allegedly, he found an ally in Frederick Pabst. Seavey says that he sold his property for $14,000 and he bought 10% of the Pabst Rosebud Mining Company, supposedly made up of 10 men each with a 10% share. But only Seavey and a local insurance man were ever named publicly, and it isn't clear that the Pabst Rosebud Mining Company ever actually existed. He left for the Klondike, and unlike the majority of people attracted to the rush, actually made it to Dawson City. Dawson City had ballooned from a town of a few hundred to between 30 and 40,000 in a matter of months, but only around half actually prospected, and a much smaller number found any gold. Like most other gold rushes, only a tiny proportion actually got rich. Seavey wasn't one of them. They arrived too late to make good claims. The others said that only a few test beds were made before they all ran out of money. According to Seavey, the only time I made any real money in Alaska was when I got $500 for hoisting up a large safe that had fallen through the floor of a saloon. He was back in the U.S. by 1899, with hardly a dime to his name. He did not, however, return to his family. No divorce record has been found, but both remarried. Seavey's second wife would repeatedly file for divorce and allege that he beat her. She ended up in the hospital several times. 1899 saw him finally find his calling when he got hold of a scow schooner called the Rambler, which he ran with only one other crewman, his sister. In 1900, he sold the Rambler and acquired a new ship, the 40-foot schooner he dubbed the Wanderer, which he sailed out of Escanaba, Wisconsin. The town of 6,000 was then the iron port of the world and shipped more than 3 million tons of iron annually. His schooner was too small to transport iron, but he transported smaller cargoes of fruit and was alleged to move hay for illegal horse racing. His ship was also said to be a floating gambling hall, and that it dealt in booze, stolen sawmills, and other loot, bristling with pistols and shotguns and shanghaied girls, whose easy virtues were traded for the coin of the realm at all lake ports. He certainly worked in prostitution, but it's less clear if he shanghaied women or merely transported women who would come aboard. In 1903, a number of boys were arrested for stealing various articles, a number of which turned up on the Wanderer. Seavey swore he had no idea the items had been stolen. Seavey was also known as a pugilist, apparently happy to fight just about anybody, anywhere. He supposedly fought one man to a bloody pulp on the ice in Frankfort, Michigan. Another tale has him finding a rough-and-ready fighter in a tavern and breaking just about everything in the tavern before the law arrived to stop it. Another tale has him beating a man and finally tipping over a piano to finish him off. The man is said to have died from his wounds later that night. A similar story also appears later in his life, but it isn't clear if either were true. He ran the Wanderer as a legitimate business, transporting goods as well as hunting and fishing parties, but he also was finding ways to make money in less standard ways. He scavenged abandoned ships that came aground, and in 1905 was photographed taking what he could from the Vega, which had been run aground for years. He was suspected of robbing the John M. Nickel only days after it had run aground in 1906. At least once, he was reported to have a boatload of caviar without a clear source. His most common tactic seemed to have been moving alcohol and poached venison from the Upper Peninsula. He was also known to sail quietly into ports at night to steal cargo from warehouses and anchored ships. He was also well known for causing ship accidents by extinguishing existing lights or placing false lights along the shore. In the early 20th century, the world was far less electrified and much darker at night, and ships relied on shore lights to navigate at night. Called moon cussing, the vandalized lights would cause ships to sail into rocks, and the Wanderer would be close behind to relieve the wounded ships of their cargo. Seavey was never caught in the act, but rumors abounded. One legend even claims Seavey once killed everyone on board a ship that attempted to compete with him, although there's no evidence. 1908 would see Seavey perform his most legendary act, stealing the Nellie Johnson. Like everything associated with Seavey, stories abound. Some say that he owned the craft or that he worked on it while it was owned by Pabst, although there's no record that Pabst or Seavey ever owned it. On June 11th, however, he came aboard at Grand Haven, supposedly with a large amount of alcohol, which he shared with the crew. Another version had him meet the crew at a tavern instead, where he drank them under the table. Whatever the truth, before the night was through, the captain and the crew were skunk drunk, and Seavey was sailing the Nellie Johnson. The ship carried cedar posts, lucrative cargo in the day, which Seavey took to Chicago. It isn't clear if he managed to sell the cargo, but finally, it seems, the drunk captain had been able to report his ship stolen. The revenue cutter service was enlisted to give chase in the Tuscarora, captained by Preston Uberoth. On June 23rd, Uberoth sent a telegraph to the Treasury Department reporting that the men on board the schooner are Daniel Seavey, William Loquist, and Hugh Colton, known in Chicago as lawless men. 4 days later, Uberoth located Seavey aboard the Wanderer. According to Uberoth, we sighted the schooner under full sail with a good stiff breeze, sailing directly out into the lake. Tuscarora steamed after her at a speed so great that the heat of the funnel burned off all the paint. The chase lasted an hour or two before they caught up and boarded Seavey's ship. Uberoth openly called Seavey the pirate. The chase was perhaps less dramatic than all that, though. The Sturgeon Bay Advocate bet dollars to donuts none of the desperate pirates were armed, and said that Wanderer could only manage 8 miles per hour with a hurricane behind her. Seavey was arrested on the charge of mutiny and revolt. His capture was accompanied by a flurry of newspaper reports about a wild chase on the lake and the capture of a alleged pirate, and that cannons had been fired, and many reported that he was arrested on the charge of piracy, though he was never actually tried for that. The charges were later dropped, though the exact circumstances aren't clear. The Nellie Johnson's captain may have failed to appear, or Seavey may have been ably defended by a lawyer. Later legends would suggest that the grand jury was bribed. Much of the legendary story seems to have been embellished by the press. Though he was never officially accused of piracy, Seavey's legend grew, and he is famously called the only pirate of the Great Lakes, or the only man ever charged with piracy on the Great Lakes, neither of which seems to be strictly true. Seavey went free, continued in much the way he had. He was caught once with soiled doves, that is prostitutes, aboard, and papers reported his old tricks were well known. One article colorfully said Seavey was beyond redemption, would find delight in doing wrong. He lost a ship in the blizzard of 1913 and is reported dead in a fire that he managed to escape. He continued working on the lake until 1926, and after that he is said to have accepted a position with the U.S. Marshals, ironically sought to curb smuggling, poaching, and piracy. He claimed many things, that he stole boats, that he led archaeologists to ancient ruins. He even claimed to have been a stunt double in a Hollywood movie production on the lake. Eventually, he retired to live with a daughter, died after a long life, anticlimactically, in a nursing home in 1949. Many more stories adorn the legend of Dan Seavey, the Great Lakes pirate. Stories of his victorious battles and his daring adventures and even his kindness towards children abound, even though few of those have any real documentation, and the legend probably well exceeds reality. Of his shadier pursuits, the Escanaba Daily News said of him that he was probably more accused than guilty. And he loved contributing to those legends himself. One newspaper said of him, stories always were Dan's specialty. But he did operate at a unique time when the Great Lakes were sort of a forgotten frontier, where men like Dan could operate on the edge of legality and still be a pirate in the middle of encroaching civilization. And that his legend still exists today and has even grown says maybe less about Dan and more about us, that even in a world that has been fully encroached by civilization, we still seek that life of adventure. Because after all, don't all good stories involve pirates? I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on Forgotten History, all you have to do is subscribe.